Hi everyone, Tracy DW here. To all our new listeners, welcome and make yourself at home. And if you're a regular listener, welcome back and thank you so much for your continued support for this podcast series and my work. I have often said that there is a common narrative which runs through all my podcast episodes, and that is firstly, that Africans were not passive in their struggle for maintaining their identities and regaining liberation. And secondly, Africa is not one homogeneous entity, but diverse groups of tribes, customs, values, lineages, and socio-political structures. The tensions and conflicts created as a result of bringing people together who are not compatible is the tragedy and legacy of colonialism. It's therefore natural that the process of decolonisation would perpetuate further tension and conflict between people who have different ideologies regarding freedom and liberation, and ways of how to go about it. Zimbabwe is a prime example of how this phenomenon played out against the backdrop of the rise of nationalism across the African continent. In this podcast episode, I'll explore this by comparing the two political bodies of the indigenous population, ZANU and ZAPU, as they sought to achieve liberation by any means necessary. Therefore, I want to explore some similarities and contrasts between these two parties, what made each party different in their origins, representation, patronage, approach and strategies, and their common goal in helping their people move towards freedom and eventually independence. This landlocked country located in southern Africa that shares its borders with Mozambique, Zambia, Botswana and South Africa was colonised by the British through the exploits of Cecil John Rhodes, who established the British South African Company to monopolise the use and ownership of the land due to the discovery of diamonds. This was one of the catalysts for the scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference in 1884. As the country was renamed Rhodesia and its capital city renamed Salisbury, British troops deposed and drove out King Mzilikazi, as well as subjugating other tribes such as the Shona and Ndebele, whose response to this was the First Liberation War, or First Chimurenga, from 1896 to 97. It's important to note that during the 1880s, Britain also was in a dispute with Portugal over the right to ownership. It's important to note that during the 1880s, Britain was also in a dispute with Portugal over the right to ownership of Zimbabwe, as well as the land now known as Malawi and Zambia. Have a listen to my podcast episode called The Pink Mac Project, The Ultimate Paradox, for more about this dispute. British occupation intensified as more and more war veterans from World Wars I and II claimed the land as compensation for their war efforts and developed systems of farming. A structure of segregation mirroring apartheid in South Africa was imposed between British and native Africans. Nationalism became ever more prominent in the 1950s, and Ghana's independence in 1957 was a watershed moment. However, like South Africa, Rhodesia made the grave mistake of overlooking British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's prophetic Wind of Change speech during Macmillan's tour of Africa in 1960. And you can listen to both my standard and expanded podcast episodes about this speech as well. As a result, Rhodesia also went through a period of defiance toward Britain and the West when contradictions and disagreements between British and Rhodesian administrations resulted in Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith's unilateral declaration of independence in 1965. This declaration saw consolidation of control over all public services and other forms of governing, resulting in farmland and housing redistribution, which further displaced the native African population, sustaining the white minority rule across Rhodesia. In protest, two parties emerged from the native African people: the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, and the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, whose combined guerrilla tactics placed pressure on the Rhodesian security forces. And this conflict is what we now refer to as the Second Chemurenga, or Zimbabwean War of Liberation, from 1964 to 1979. The war ended as a result of pressure from the US and South Africa for Rhodesia to concede to Britain in the Lancaster House Agreement in London 1979, presided over by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. This was soon followed by a democratic election in 1980, with victory for the ZANU party, and its leader Robert Mugabe was sworn in as PM. The date of the 18th of April marks the annual Day of Independence for a country with its capital city renamed Harare and its rebirth under the name of Zimbabwe. Like South Africa, native Africans in Rhodesia had formed their own national congress, but due to its disbandment and arrest of many of its leaders by Rhodesian forces, another way of political mobilisation was sought. It began in 1960 with the formation of the National Democratic Party, or NDP, founded by Joshua Nkomo, with other associates such as Robert Mugabe and Herbert Chitipo, representing the interests of both Shona and Ndebele tribes. However, there was also Rhodesian opposition to the NDP, causing further arrests. After the disbandment of the NDP, ZAPU, Zimbabwe African People's Union, was formed by Nkomo in 1962. However, internal disagreements about the direction and leadership of ZAPU led to a split, resulting in Robert Mugabe breaking away to form ZANU and the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, or ZANLA, as its military arm. In response to this, ZAPU formed its own military arm in the form of the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, or ZIPRA. The first phase of the war played out between 1964 and 1971, where both parties deployed differing guerrilla tactics. However, the second phase from 1971 saw both factions uniting to form the Joint Guerrilla Alliance, attempting to overthrow the government. Despite victory, the actions and events surrounding both political factions exemplifies how deeply divided nationalists were. This was not only influenced by differing approaches to achieving liberation, but also a desire from some native Africans to see the status quo of the current government remain. Many factors influenced people's perception of justice and equality, and if the current system was of a benefit to some native Africans, then they saw no reason for change. So, what of the contrast and similarities of the two parties? ZAPU was formed and led by Joshua Nkomo of the Ndebele tribe, based around Ndebele ethnicity, and was supported by the Soviet Union and East Germany. Their tactics were indirect in nature and approach, preferring negotiation rather than force, with storming the heavens planned strategies through airstrikes. They planned to take victory after relying on ZANLA to do the heavy lifting. ZANU was formed and led by Robert Mugabe and represented the interests of the Shona people. This faction was supported predominantly by China, and their strategy was on land, planting landmines, rather than in the air. But they sustained most of the attacks from Rhodesian armed forces on their own training camps. You can also see the main world superpowers at work as Britain and the US sought a smooth transition towards self-governance for Zimbabwe, while the Soviet Union and China sought to destabilise and control this process using both ZANU and ZAPU as a vehicle to establish their own agendas across the African continent. This dynamic was the underlying narrative that infiltrated much of Africa's decolonisation process and reflected in Macmillan's speech indicating Britain's anxiety about the threat of communism. This podcast episode also complements my poetic narrative, Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix, inspired by events over the last 40 years and up to the death of its president, Robert Mugabe, that have affected Zimbabwe. Developments that have taken place since the death of its first post-colonial Prime Minister have been hailed with success as well as tinged in controversy. A return to Zimbabwean currency led to hyperinflation of 500% in early 2020, causing widespread economic hardship, and over 20,000 suspected cases with nearly 400 deaths were caused by an outbreak of cholera between 2023 and 2024. On the 26th of August 2023, presidential and parliamentary elections resulted in Emmerson Mnangagwa's re-election, with around 52.6% of the vote. The main opposition party rejected the outcome and alleged widespread fraud, and a law banning criticism of the government was signed the following month. In March 2024, the US imposed sanctions on President Mnangagwa, his wife, Vice President Chiwenga, and others for alleged human rights abuses, corruption and mineral smuggling. But by December 2024, a new land policy was unveiled, allowing black farmers to own and transfer land taken under Mugabe's land seizures in 2000, making it eligible as bank collateral. This marked a major shift in agrarian reform policy. In July 2025, Zimbabwe qualified for the Rugby World Cup for the first time since 1991, and its latest economic report shows Zimbabwe's GDP is projected to grow at around 6%, recovering from drought and currency instability, thanks to a more stable gold-backed currency, launched in April last year. If you liked this podcast, then stay on this listening platform, click the subscribe button and check out my other episodes related to this one, such as Looking Back in Anger, What's Next for Zimbabwe from the second season, and The Story So Far Part 6 from the third, as well as all the other podcast episodes that I mentioned in this episode. The links are in the bio. And don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement. My stories, or poetic narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Nights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. These are all available on the website in paperback, on Amazon in Kindle format, and in ebook format at Apple Books and all other digital platforms. And also the publication of the latest 4 titles. Now, if you want to find out more, just visit storiestobetold.com and check out the learning platforms for The Journey's End, Giving Back Hong Kong, Bite from the Big Apple, A Story for New York, A Story for South Africa, and the inspiration for this podcast episode, Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix. And if you'd like to sign up to my email list, just visit the website where you can opt in and receive your free samples of my first 4 titles. And finally, remember that you can also send me an audio message on the SpeakPipe link, which is also in the show notes, so don't be a stranger. Feel free to like, follow and share us on social media when you visit the website. just click onto whichever social media platform you would like to follow us on. And, as always, it's a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast series, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own, because history is a matter of fact or perspective. I'm Tracy DW, and this is a Stories to be Told podcast. Stay safe, stay well, stay blessed. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next page.